All right, folks, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out today. My name is Emmett. I will be the announcer here today. Just wanted to thank you all for making it out to the second annual Nagios World Conference. Today, our speaker here is Sheeri Cabral, and she is, since 2001, Senior Database Architect with Mozilla Firefox. And she's also doing the MySQL Database Community podcast available on iTunes. So everybody give a big round of applause to Sherri here.
Thanks, Emmett. I do want to clarify your notes. There were two sentences there. I've been using Nagios since 2001, and I'm a senior database admin architect at Mozilla. I've only been at Mozilla a year, so didn't want to do that. So this is alerting with MySQL and Nagios. Who here? I'm assuming everyone here kind of uses. Who here uses MySQL and uses Nagios to? Okay, good. So the biggest problem with Nagios, right, is what are you going to alert on? And you do want to alert. I know there's a talk later about alerting on actual user experience as opposed to just, is HTTP running, right? You probably want to see that a page actually is delivered. But the biggest problem in anything is you want to monitor something that you can fix. So for example, you don't want to get paged that there's a long-running query if your answer is always just, well, let it go. You only want to get paged for a long-running query if your answer is, let's kill it. So a long-running query might not really be something you want to page on unless it's running really long or unless it's locking other queries. So you might want to page on if you're getting queries that are locked, for example. You don't really care how long something takes. It could take forever in MySQL. You don't care. As long as it's not interfering with anything else, that's the important thing. Backup disk space, right? You want to alert about that. Max connections. If you're getting close to your limit of maximum connections, what MySQL will do if you hit max connections is it will say, sorry, we're closed, no more connections, you can't connect, which to the end user going through a web app is usually the page keeps loading and nothing happens, or maybe there's an error, which is not usually desired. The point of max connections was so that you didn't end up using too many threads, which would use too much memory, which would crash MySQL. But the fix, at least in today's world, is kind of the same as the crash. It doesn't really matter that it didn't crash, except for the fact because the user still can't get to the data. Except, of course, when you crash, you could risk corruption and all that kind of stuff. So crashing is bad, but if you can't get to the database at all, that's bad too. And you can easily monitor max connections, theoretically, to be able to figure out if you want to increase that or decrease the number of connections coming if you have a connection pool. So the thing I love about Nagios is that anyone can write a plugin. Now, the problem with Nagios is anyone can write a plugin. And anyone who's downloaded something from Nagios Exchange, and, like downloaded 3 or 4 different things, it's like when you want a free program for your phone or something, and you're like, I just want to know what the weather is, and you download one thing, and it kind of tells you like the temperature, and you're like, but it doesn't tell you if it's going to rain. So then you go to download the second one. So there are official Nagios plugins for MySQL. They're Check MySQL and Check MySQL Query. What Check MySQL does is it checks for database connectivity. It checks if you want to. If it's a slave, it'll check if the slave is running, and that will also check the slave lag using seconds behind master. I'm pretty sure that's all it does. I haven't looked at it in a while. One of the problems with using something for a long time is that you kind of get it in your head that this is what this does, and it might do other things, but you don't go back and read the changes or release notes. So feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. At any time, by the way, raise your hand. I interrupt people all the time, so I have it coming to me. So feel free to just raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and we'll do stuff. Check MySQL Query is actually good. It checks the output of a query is within a certain range. But it's numeric. It has to be a numerical range, and you have to give the range itself. So you can't just say if something's greater than 0. You have to say if it's between 0 and like a million or 1 in a million. You can't just say, oh, I want to make sure that it's whatever. And it has to be numerical. So there are limitations, but it's pretty good for that kind of getting the user experience of the database isn't just running. It can actually perform a query and actually get something. So for example, if you have some kind of queue that should always have something in it, you can use this to do that. And we use that at Mozilla. So here's a list of third-party plugins. Back a couple years ago when I wanted to do stuff with MySQL, a little more robust with MySQL, I was looking at, there were 7 different plugins, including the Check MySQL standard. And they all did different things. So in MySQL, you have system variables, which can be seen by doing a show variables, and that's what you set in the my.cnf configuration file. There's also status variables, which is what you get when you say show status. So that could be things like how long has the system been up. There's an uptime status. how many connections are currently being used, right? Max used connections versus your system variables are things like how many max connections are set, so that's max connections. How much memory should be devoted to a certain buffer pool, for example. Those are system variables. Only one of the 7 ones that I had downloaded at the time had any caching at all. Now, why is caching important? If you want to check 100 things on your MySQL server, variables, values, status, anything like that, you don't want to have to connect 100 times, every, say, 5 minutes, if you're running these checks every 5 minutes. You don't want to have each check run, go to MySQL, do a show variables, come back and get that. Because what happens is whenever anything gets a little slow, you end up going to your database and you're like, what's taking up all my connections when it's slow? And all you see is the Nagios daemon running, and you're like, oh, it's Nagios, 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 Nagios is running a query, and then Nagios is running a query. Oh, look, Nagios is running a query. So it gets tedious, and there's no reason not to just cache it. It's really easy to cache things. We do it, you can do it easily in a file or anything like that. And then the other thing was calculations. I wanted to be able to do arbitrary calculations. By arbitrary, I mean take any system variable, any status variable, and just calculate with it. What if I want to know about the last time, how many max connections that you have, for example, would be max used connections divided by max connections times 100, right? Get the percentage of max connections. But there were only 2 actual third-party plugins that had any calculations at all, and they were all hard-coded. And by hard-coded, I mean they had modes that said, oh, here's this max connection mode that does this calculation, which is great. But I'm a DBA. I know what I want to calculate. Some things I want to calculate rates of slow queries, maybe. And if it didn't have that hard-coded calculation, I was out of luck. So this is what I saw a lot too. And God love open source. Let us know what you'd like to see, which is awesome. But to me, that became code word with those hard-coded things for if something changes, we're going to have to change our code, right? If there's a new release of MySQL and a variable name changes, we're going to have to change our code. And I wanted arbitrary values. I want to be able to say, look, if the variable name changes, let me just change my Nagios options and variables, and that's it. So not having seen that, I made one myself. So this is what I wanted, which was, I could use any arbitrary system variables, status variables. It would cache, and it would be flexible calculations that I could do myself. Now, obviously, none of these have that, but very few even have, none of them had caching, which had calculations at all. There were some where you could only do status variables or only do system variables or some of the other. It wasn't a good solution for me. So I made MySQL healthcheck.pl back when I was at a consulting company because we had a lot of clients who, we wanted to monitor. So let's talk a little about caching. So caching just saves information to a file. What it does is there is a directory that you give it, and that's probably here, yeah, cache directory, path to directory. And what it does is it uses that file instead of connecting again. And the file consists of the host name and the port. So MySQL can only have one instance of MySQL per port and IP, or host name. So even if you're running multiple instances on a machine, you can still cache for all that. Max cache age. So this is important. How long do you cache it for? When do you go and look at the file and look how old it is, and then invalidate that and go and get it? So you can give it a max cache age of seconds. What I've usually implemented is it's a regular 5-minute Nagios check, a 5-minute interval, and then make the max cache age 5 minutes. Which means if you're only running one check with this, there's no point in caching. But if the second you run a second check, now you're using a cached file. Now, what if you don't want to use the cache? You can do -- no cache. Maybe you have some kind of calculation that you always want to use current data. You can actually do -- no cache. So we are giving that option too. So it's very flexible because I said I don't want to be forced to use the cache, right? You can use -- no cache, or you can not put in the cache dir if you don't want it. But if you want to force the connection, but then have that cache things. So for example, later on I'll show you how you can look at process list entries. So with process list entries, we wanted to get the most current one, but that result should be cached. So here's the meat of it. So there's a few modes. The first mode that I'm going to talk about is variable comparison mode, or varcomp mode. There's an array that we have called metadata, and it's an associative array, I guess is what you call it. I may be using these terms wrong, but it's an array of arrays. So var status is an array that has variables, the system and status variables. And that's an array because that's variable name and value. And it's part of the metadata array. So it takes the output of show global variables and show global status, and it puts it into this array. We're also using a dash expression, which allows word replacement. So what you do is you put the words in. You want uptime, you'd write the word uptime. And the script just dumbly goes and has this array and says, well, does anything in the key, anything in the array key match? If it does, then use the value. So it's very dumb, which makes it very flexible. And then you can have dash warning, dash critical, and they're flexible too. So this is written in Perl, which I didn't say. And it's all just Perl expressions as well as this word replacement. So as long as you don't do something dumb like make something that has like a word that's divided by, or like the time symbol, you'll be good. But there's a lot of stuff you can do, and because you can use Perl expressions, if you wanted to extend this and make your own kind of Perl expression, you like take uptime and just make it into days or something, and you have some kind of human readable format, you could actually just use that human readable format Perl subroutine in your code. So here's a sample command definition. This should probably look pretty familiar for most people. So for example, this is checking the temporary tables, the rate of temporary tables in MySQL. So you have a command name, check MySQL temp tables, and here's the command line. So you have MySQL health check.pl. You can see that, right? Good. Host name, so this is where you put the host, user, my user, password, my pass. This is all, any check you kind of do this. The cache directory, varlib nagios MySQL cache, max cache age is 300. And this is the meat of it, right? Mode varcomp, expression equals, created temp tables, divided by uptime since flush status. These two are status variables. The little hint of how you could tell status variables versus system variables, besides thinking about it and saying, is this kind of a status or something you would set, right? You wouldn't set how many temporary tables were created, and you wouldn't set an uptime. But the easy way is to say, does it begin with a capital letter or not? So capital letters are pretty much status variables, and lowercase letters are system variables. For the most part, there are some exceptions. And then here we have the warning is greater than 8 divided by 60, and the critical is greater than 10 divided by 60. This is a little contrived, but you said, why not just use the numbers or whatever? But what we're saying is warn if there's more than 8 temporary tables per minute. And give a critical if there's more than 10 temporary tables per minute, because the uptime since flush status is in seconds. So basically, if there are 8 created temp tables in every 60 seconds of uptime, then warn, and if there's 10, then go critical. So this is just kind of an example to show that you could make arbitrary complex warnings and criticals as well as the expression. So here's what the service definition would look at like. There's nothing special here, but if you wanted to use arguments, this is where you'd put them. So what about rates? One of the things about rates is you could say something like, well, how many, here we have a rate of the created temp table since the last time you flushed. Do you really want to flush every 5 minutes to check that rate? No. What if you want to say, well, what's the rate now and what's the rate 5 minutes from now? Compared to last time, has the rate dramatically changed? Has it increased by 10%? So maybe you get 10 slow queries every second, and you don't care if that's your baseline. But if you're going to get 100 queries every second, you want to know about that, because that's something to look at. Maybe people just did a release and they didn't let you know that they were doing a release, and you find out the hard way because load all of a sudden goes up. That's what rates are for. So this mode, instead of varcomp, is called last varcomp. And what you have is you have available to you, you have hashes called current and last run. And you can put the expressions in there. So for example, here's a query, check a query rate. So here you have, you run MySQL health check.pl, your host name, username, password, all that. Mode last run varcomp. The expression now is you're going to take the current queries, and queries is a MySQL system, status variable, begins with a capital letter. So you take the current minus the last run divided by the current uptime minus the last run uptime. So we're not hard coding anything here. If you run this every 5 minutes, I'm not putting 300 in the denominator here. I'm putting, you just subtract. The last time this ran, what was the uptime? Now what it's running. You're going to get some wacky things if the machine has just restarted. But if the machine just restarted, you want to know anyway. And there's actually a check for that too. So here's where you can do that. I would probably be best to use an absolute value here, which I didn't put in. But if the comparison is greater than 80, so what do I have? So what does that mean? That means if you have, I think I just used the same comparison from before, but this is if you have more than, I guess, 80 queries per second, or 80% difference, which should be times 100. Let me change that so these slides are right. What is absolute value in Perl just ABS? Yeah, because that'll work. Lowercase. On MySQL DB, I do nothing in lowercase. So let's make this so you can see it. So yes, so now this is actually an appropriate example. So you take the absolute value of this whole expression times 100. So if it's greater than 80%, so if there's an 80% difference, then you want to know. And comparison, by the way, is just shorthand for critical. You could just say warning or critical, but the first time I wrote it, I just used comparison, and it was just critical, and that's it. And then we added critical and warning. So what about some other modes? There is a mode called long query or locked query, and those will look at the times in the show process list to see how long it's been running. So that will just look at the time. And there's also locked query, which shows how long a query has been locked for. So maybe you want a page if something's locked for more than a minute, more than 5 minutes, something like that. And that uses this, there's an array called proclist. So instead of the array called var status, it uses the array called proclist, which gets its information from the show full process list command in MySQL. So it's very easily extendable. If you have some kind of thing that could be made into a list of key value that can be put into an array, you can then put it in there. So here's a sample command definition for the locked query mode. This top part, we talked about already, cacher. So the blue part is the important part. The mode is locked query, and then you just have warning and critical. And that's the time at which, if it's greater than that, it will be a warning or page, critical. So what if you wanted to extend information? So there is a subroutine called fetch server metadata, and what that does is it fetches metadata from the server. We've talked about the metadata array, and all you have to do is add a new hash key to metadata. So metadata, this is the actual line from the code, which is how you get metadata, is var status, and it does a DB handle to show global variables. So literally when I say, it takes the output of show global variables and puts it into an array, you can look at what all these do. I think this is a special subroutine in the program as opposed to a Perl one that comes with Perl. But you can take a look at it, see what it does. It just puts it into an array and then assigns that array to metadata var status. Here's from show engine enodb status. You can see very little has changed. We just change what's in here, change what's in, change the key here, enodb status, and then the query itself is show engine enodb status. So it's very easy to extend the information if you want to do stuff. I started working on something that would actually extend it by looking at the information schema and looking at the data size, and then maybe comparing it to the file size on disk so you could see if there was fragmentation. But that's a little more difficult because you're actually doing stuff within MySQL and without MySQL, outside of MySQL. So for example, metadata enodb status already exists. It's unused right now. But if people wanted to do something, the problem with show engine enodb status is that the output is not in a good key value form. But if you wanted to do something like from show master status or show slave status, it would be really easy to do. I haven't done that because the MySQL checks that come with Nagios are fine for doing replication lag. But if you really wanted to check, if you wanted to monitor to make sure that there were no tables being ignored or databases being ignored, you could do that too. So what are some standard checks you might do? Percentage of max connections. That's just threads connected divided by max connections times 100. So, so here you have threads connected, it's capital T, that's your status variable, divided by max connections times 100. Now anyone who's a MySQL DBA is going to look at this and be like, really, that's all I have to do? That's my expression? Like that's, you know exactly what that's doing. And you can change it if you want to. That's the best thing. If they all of a sudden change the variable name to max cons, all you have to do is change Nagios. You don't have to change anything in the script itself. The plugin doesn't need to change. Certainly it's a lot less work for the people who are developing this, which is great because I don't want someone to be like, oh, they changed the variable name. Could you update the code? And I'm like, I got other things I'm doing. You change the variable name. Or could you add this calculation to it? No, you can. There's nothing there to have to fiddle around with if variable names change. If new variable names come in, all of a sudden, the new release of MySQL comes out, and a day later, everybody wants to monitor the sexy new feature. Well, now you can. So what if InnoDB is enabled? I don't know about you, but I've run into a problem where I didn't realize that MySQL had a problem starting up, and there was some kind of problem with InnoDB starting up, and InnoDB didn't work. So now, well, it works. It's just that now everything's MyISOM. And you can't access your InnoDB tables. So this is a little check that's pretty easy to do. The expression is have InnoDB. That's your status variable. And the comparison is if it doesn't equal yes, please page me. Again, comparison is just a synonym for critical. So there's no real warning on that. It's either there or it's not. You either want to be paged or not. Here's a big one. Did MySQL crash? You can't. MySQL is great because it has this wrapper daemon that if it crashes, we'll restart it right away. The problem is if you set Nagios to check every 5 minutes or something, even every minute, you might not catch if MySQL is unavailable. This is a huge thing. So what you can do is use uptime. So use uptime, you say if the comparison is less than 1800. This is what we use at Mozilla. If it's crashed within the last half hour, let me know. I probably could have said the last 10 minutes, but just in case there's something. Like if there's been a restart in the last half hour, I want to know. Now this makes maintenance a little more annoying because I have to add half an hour to my maintenance window whenever I'm doing it because I know the uptime won't be green, as I say. Won't be green until half an hour later. But it's really nice to know because sometimes you get your dev machine crashes in the middle of the night and you never would have known. Now you can go in before the devs come in. Well, I can because I work on the East Coast. Most of my devs are on the West Coast. I can go in before they come in and That's the thing about IT. You never want someone to tell you about a problem. You always want to know ahead of time. And in fact, it's a funny story about Nagios. I said I've been using it since 2001. And I was lucky enough to work for Tufts University when we were installing monitoring. I had a great mentor there who's like, oh, monitoring's so important. You got to do it. She taught me Nagios, and I've been using it ever since. I left there and went to a company called Manhunt. It's the biggest online gay dating site in the world, blah, 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 blah. And they had no monitoring because they had in-house customer service. And I was like, well, I want to install monitoring. Can I do that? And they were like, well, we don't have the machines to really do that. And why do we need to do that? If replication dies, because every so often, replication in MySQL dies, we know within 5 minutes because what happens is, some queries went to the reads and some queries went to writes. And so what would happen is once you logged into the site, you would start seeing yourself. But if you didn't see yourself when you had logged in, it meant replication was broken. So they were like, well, the customer service guys just walk over. And I was like, okay, you're clearly not understanding. Let's get the customers mad first and then fix the problem. So I was like, well, if I wanted to just install if I just wanted to monitor database stuff, and I just want to do it like on this test server over here, and they were like, well, what you do with your servers is your problem. So I was like, okay, great. Within a month, everyone's like, oh, can you monitor HTML, HTTP too? Can you monitor this? Can you monitor that? So that was kind of a little like subversive win, but I was just like, really, people? Like you don't want especially the customers to tell you, your end users. But I'm a DBA. The developers are my customers, so I don't want them to come to me and say, what happened? Why is my data all messed up? I want to know. I want monitoring to tell me. And so if there was a crash and there might be corruption, I want to know about it. So some more kind of standard checks. If you end up setting your slaves as read-only, you might want to check for that. You might want to make sure that people can't write to your read slaves. So you can set your expression to be read-only, and then your comparison is not equal to yes. And again, this is Perl not equal to. There's some quoting going on. You might have to do some fancy escaping if you want nested levels of quotes. This is certainly fine. Percent of sleeping connections. This is an interesting thing. In MySQL, if you have a connection and it's not doing anything, it's sleeping. Right? It's just sitting there doing nothing. So if you log in and you don't type anything for 3 seconds, you'll say sleep for 3 seconds. This can be a problem if you have connections that aren't disconnecting properly. So it's fine if you have persistent connections, they're not doing anything, that's great. But if somebody is, coded their application, they didn't put a close in there properly, what can end up happening is when you have high traffic times, the web server or whatever will connect, and it will run a query, and it won't actually disconnect properly. You end up running up against your maximum connections. So if you end up having this kind of problem, you might want to check out how many connections are sleeping. And if 90% of your connections are sleeping, and you're not using persistent connections, you might want to look and say, why are there so many sleeping connections? I don't need so many sleeping connections. If you're not doing anything, disconnect. So how can you get that in MySQL? Well, there is no number of sleeping connections. There's threads connected, there's number of threads running, and there's max connected. So now we have to do some math, which is great. So your math is take the number of threads connected minus the number of threads running, right? So how many threads are actually running a query? So this gives you a number of how many queries are sleeping, how many threads are sleeping. Take the total number of connected, subtract the ones that are running, you get the ones that are sleeping. Take that quantity, divide by max connections, and multiply by 100 to get a percent. So this is your percentage of max connections that are sleeping. So it's not the percentage of running queries connected queries that are sleeping. Because if there's 2 connections and 1 is sleeping, that's a 50% rate. You don't really care about that. You care about how, if you have 100 connections, that's only 1% that's sleeping. That's okay. And then the comparison is greater than an argument. I threw that in there just to show you arguments. You guys probably know how to use Nagios, so this is all familiar to you. What are the limitations? I always like to say this is what this doesn't do, because whenever I go to something and they're like, oh, there's this great feature, I'm like, so when wouldn't I use it? Because it always seems like it can slice bread, do your homework, make dinner, and I'm like, but when wouldn't I use it? So here's the limitations. The limitation is that it's 1 check or calculation per Nagios service. Right? So every time you run that MySQL health check, you can only do 1 check or calculation. But since you can use so many variables, it's not a big deal. And also you have cached output. So it's really not a big deal to have more than 1 Nagios service defined if you want to do that. If you want 100 different checks, there's 100 different Nagios checks you have to do. Not a big deal. And that's kind of the standard for Nagios. It doesn't output performance data right now. It just gives you kind of yes or no. But I can imagine that wouldn't be hard to do. Just take whatever number and put it first. That's the output. It's Perl. It's whatever you want to print, you can print. So it wouldn't be hard. I haven't had the need for it. I try to get people to use PNP for Nagios, which is that still the standard for graphing? Okay. Because I'm like, it's like Cacti, except you don't have to configure all the machines again in Cacti. But people have existing Cacti, so that's what they use. So I haven't modified it for performance data. But if you're using it, it would be fantastic to just easily modify to say, here's the actual number that comes out. And where do you get it? There are links here. I don't expect you to remember this GitHub link. You could probably Google search for PalomeinoDB GitHub. PalomeinoDB is the company that I was working for before where we wrote these checks. But if you go to palomeinoDB.com, go to the community tab and then the projects, so it's like a menu, community projects, you'll find it. Also, if you have these slides, you'll get them. And I tweeted the slides earlier, and I know the slides are going to be available at the conference website. And it's going to be kind of hard to miss. And I actually I also posted a blog post with them. So if you go to Sheeri.com, you should see a blog post with them. Yeah.
But you didn't put them on Exchange? Nagios Exchange?
I think Ethan put them on Nagios Exchange for me, right?
I know we saw a post that you did in the past. We may have.
Yeah, because you contacted me and you were like, do you want to put this on Nagios Exchange? And I don't remember if I did or is it on there or it's not on there? If you're going to heckle me, you better have your data straight. That's all I'm saying. It should be on there. If it's not on there, let me know, and I will put it on there. It should be on there. I don't have the power to delete all the other ones, unfortunately. But what you should have asked is, why isn't it shipping with Nagios yet? That's really, how come it's not default in Nagios? That's the question. Is it there? You're still looking. OK. So now there's other Nagios plugins. We do have a little bit more time. There are other Nagios plugins. Does anyone have any questions, comments, suggestions, feedback, other than make sure it's on the Exchange before I go into the other? That's kind of a bonus extra. OK?
So do you have one question? Those equations that you put up on the screen, do you have those documented somewhere?
The question is, are all these equations that I had on my screen documented somewhere? Other than in the slides, probably not. There is a pretty good README on the let's see. There we go. Look at that. I visited it before. There's a pretty good README for the MySQL health check that has some of them. Like here's max used connections divided by max connections. Current queries, this is the var comp one. This is where I copied it from. That's why it doesn't have the absolute value and the times 100. So there isn't a good list of kind of standard checks, but the problem with standards is that they're so great, and that's why there's so many of them. So I kind of encourage people to do their own thing. That's why these kind of say standard checks, quote unquote, because if you're not using read-only for your slaves, then it's not really a good check. If you don't care about the percentage of sleeping connections, it's not a good check. But you might care about those. These are things that people tended to care about, and we kind of made a list of kind of the hot checks that we really wanted to do, and these were on them. And there were like some medium checks. So yeah, the standard ones, they're in the slides. But I can do a blog post about that. Let me write that down. Do a blog post with that, so that then they're easily findable, the calculations. And I can ask, the cool part is that I'm part of the blogging community in MySQL, and I can ask people what else they would use it for. So let me just write this down, and then I'll get to your question in the back. Blog post recalculations. Is there a format maybe that I should put it in? Like is there some kind of magical tutorial format or?
I'm just thinking I'll use this so it's actually, the question is on the video later.
Mm-hmm.
It would just be nice to have like examples. I know like you're a DBA. I'm not a DBA, but it would be nice like for us on our team to be able to give people examples like here are some things that a DBA actually suggested to get you started.
Right.
And then the DBAs can say, oh yeah, this is great. We also want to do this other stuff. But it's nice for us and others, I think, if you don't need to read the whole README, if you can quickly kind of see like
show
kind
me
of
the calculation.
practice, expressions, equations, yeah.
Okay.
Well, just adding to that, a lot of our MySQL is embedded in other applications, and so again, there's no DBA involved.
Right.
The application owner has really no clue what to be looking for.
Right. So the point that was made was that if MySQL is embedded, or if you don't have a full-time MySQL DBA or even a part-time MySQL DBA, you might not know what to look for. And so yeah, that's a great suggestion. It's funny because one of the earlier slides where I said the great thing about Nagios is anyone can write a plugin, and the bad thing about Nagios is I actually stole that from a quip I make about MySQL, which is the great thing about MySQL is that anyone can run MySQL, and the bad part about MySQL is that you end up, it's easy to install and it's easy to use, and then you end up with no support because you didn't need it up until the time when you really needed it. Question back there?
Yeah, is there a way to define those as like a series of files in a directory instead of having these long command line arguments? So then you can just kind of have them documented and easily runnable without the documentation getting out of sync with what's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, you could easily make a Nagios check. I think this is what you're saying. You could easily make a Nagios check that just calls the health check, right? You can make like a wrapper script, and that would be what you call from Nagios. So that you could store your username and password, for example, in there. You wouldn't have to have it in Nagios, that kind of thing. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, basically,
Okay.
and just having it be sort of distributed and documented in a form where you say like there's 20 files with 20 different queries in them. Instead
Right.
of having it in a tutorial, just have the code right there ready to run.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, you know what the thing is? If I did that, then people would use those checks, and the whole point was to have one check to do whatever you wanted and to have it documented in Nagios because that's where you're looking at it. It was more geared and oriented towards the tech-savvy user who already knows what they want to do in MySQL and what they want to do, But yeah, there's no reason that that we couldn't do that and we could have sample command definitions. That might help.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I think if you could make like a blog post on that.
Mm-hmm.
If you could make a blog post on it and have some of the DBA community post some of the most common things that they checked, it'd be something that us internally to Nagios could pretty easily add to one of our wizards. So definitely send us the link to that afterwards, and
Sure.
we'll be able to collect that information. We could maybe put that into the MySQL wizard with some common ones, and then people could also then just write in their own expressions right into the wizard, and it'd be done.
Great. I love wizards. All right. Any other questions before we go on to some bonus plugins that Palomino DB has developed? So, oh, and also, by the way, PalomeinoDB is a consulting company. So if you have like a MySQL problem, I totally recommend them. I left them because I was done with consulting in general. So not for any, anything else. So there's a Nagios plugin for partitions. If you're using table partitioning in MySQL, a lot of times what you want to do is you're using table partitioning to get kind of what they call windowing, which is we care about the data for this last week, last month, last year, but we don't really care about anything beyond that. We just want to delete it, right? This isn't for sales orders. This is for, I don't know, top 10 blog posts and the, top 10 bloggers, and you take the last month of data and the number of posts they did. So you can delete the data before that. So the problem with that is that you have to maintain the partitions. So you have to have some kind of script that comes in and adds partitions or removes partitions, and then you want to monitor that because you don't want to run out of partitions. In some cases, if you run out of partitions, an insert will fail, so you'll know right away. But in some cases, it'll just put stuff into the last partition, which is not what you want, because the whole point of partitioning is to optimize that. And once that huge partition gets to the end of the line, and that's the only partition, then you end up with a problem. So there's a Nagios check for checking that you have the right number of days, weeks, or months. So what you could say is this is a check where, again, you have a host, username, password. You have a database and a table. So you want the blog post number table to make sure that it has at least 3 weeks in the future, and every week you clear it out. And that way you have this kind of threshold of it's going to be a problem because you're supposed to have 4 weeks. If you only have 3 weeks, page me, because then at least I have 3 weeks to figure it out. So here's an example. Here's a database add-ons table, user add-ons, ranges months, and verifies 3. So verify that there's at least 3 months ahead of time of partitions. And they also have, PalomeinoDB has some scripts also, like cron scripts, to actually make those partitions and remove the partitions. But since it's not an Nagios thing, I didn't include it here. For checksums. So one of the big things that people don't know about MySQL and replication is that MySQL, at least in version 5.5, which is the current GA and under, in 5.6 this changes, there are no checksums, meaning the master replicates the slave gets the stuff from the master. You don't really have any indication that now the data on the slave is the same as the data on the master. You just kind of trust that if you do the same thing to the master and slave, you get the same results. But sometimes you can get a little skew. Sometimes that's human error or human doing the wrong things on the slaves, which is why I prefer to use read-only on the slaves to make sure that, for the most part, you can't get writes on the slave. There are ways around that. But there's a third-party tool where you can checksum the master and slave. So you run the checksum on the master, you can replicate it to the slave, and then the slave will have this table that shows any of the differences. So it'll show count and a checksum. The checksum algorithm is flexible. It can be, I think, CRC32, or is it CR32, is the default. Anyway, it's part of this toolkit from Percona called the Percona toolkit, which is why it starts with PT. So it's PT table checksum. You run that on the master. So after you do that, the slaves will have a table with the checksum, and you can actually you do a MySQL query of, show me the databases and tables and whatever in the chunks that are different, where this CRC does not equal master CRC. And that actually will show you that. So we started to implement that at Mozilla to make sure that all the masters and slaves are in sync. And just to point out, why would you want that? You might think, well, obviously you want the masters and slaves to be in sync, but the important reasons are if you ever propagate a slave to be the master, you don't want people to say, well, how come yesterday I had this data and now today I don't? What are my sales orders yesterday showed that I had 3 years of data, and now they don't show anything because at some point those entries were on the slave. And also if you use replication for, like we replicate all of our machines to a couple of different slaves, and those slaves we then back up. We can do a hot backup, cold backup, no problem. But we depend on that slave to have the proper information so that if we then restore from that slave, we want to make sure it's right. So it's really important for backups and for, the whole reason of having slaves is to make sure that they're consistent. And most people just kind of assume, well, why wouldn't it be consistent? Well, MySQL doesn't check that. So here's an example of it using, it actually has an interval too. So you have a checksum table, which is what the toolkit outputs. And then you'll have a checksum freshness, which is a number of hours since the last time it was run. So if you run, like I like to run the checksum every day. so that within a day I'll find any discrepancies. You might run it every hour. There are ways to run the checksum to run it only part of the data. So you could say run it on this first 10% of the data, and then tomorrow we'll run it on the second 10% of the data, and then so it might take 10 days to loop through all your data. So checksum freshness makes sure that that's within the interval, because you don't want to just assume that if the query comes out that everything's okay, that you're fine, because what you really want is that it's fine, but it's fine within the last day or within the last week. You don't, if your cron dies and you end up never, doing it again, you're going to go on old data. And then you could also have a list of databases to skip. So for example, you might not care if the MySQL privilege database is different. You might not care if the information schema is different or the performance schema is different. Those are the ones that I use. And we've actually modified this check. We've submitted this check back to PalominoDB. Basically, the Percono toolkit changed the way that they did the checksums, and they have different different fields in the table now. So the old one doesn't work, the one that you can download from them. If you use the new version of the table checksum and the old version of the check, they're not compatible. But the script is completely viewable in this Bugzilla bug, which again, when you download the slides, you can get the links. And there's also a blog post with that link in it. And then I have to say we're hiring. And I'm very excited about this. We're actually hiring a DBA. So I'm kind of excited the DBA team is, the IT team is completely understaffed at Mozilla, but it's all about, do we hire more developers to develop the sexy stuff, or do we hire more IT? And sometimes it's hard to justify more IT, because if everything's working smoothly, then nobody wants to hire more IT because, well, it's working smoothly. But if everything's going to pot, everybody wants to fire everyone in IT. So it's kind of hard. They're like, oh, well, if everything's going to pot, let's just outsource everything. So it's sometimes it's hard to justify headcount. So I'm very excited that there is a DBA position open. MySQL, Postgres, NoSQL. You don't need to know all of them. Like, I'm primarily a MySQL DBA. I know a little bit of Postgres, a little bit of NoSQL. So if you're like that, or if you know tons of Postgres but no MySQL, that's okay too. We're hiring also for a system administrator. And we use Red Hat Enterprise Linux, CentOS, and Fedora. So we're pretty much a Red Hat shop. And the positions are, you can work in any one of our offices that we have. There's like 6 to 9 offices, I forget which, around the world. And we only hire in certain countries due to legal whatever. So that's the US, Canada, UK, France, Spain, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Poland, China, Japan, and New Zealand. And then we're actually specifically looking for a senior Windows or Unix sysadmin for Mountain View, because most of our Windows machines are desktops. So if you're interested in working for Mozilla, it's a really great place to work. Everyone, they'll look at my shirt and they'll be like, you work at Mozilla? That must be so awesome. I'm like, yes, it really is. And if you want more resources about MySQL, again, this is where to download, palomino.com community projects. This QR code goes to the slides again, and here are the slides. Kimtag.com/MySQL is just, there's QR codes with Kimtag, so that's why it's there. If you look at the back of the podcast CDs, that's what that QR code is. It's just a bunch of resources, like if you don't know where the blogging is, it's at Planet MySQL, and just links like that. This is my email address. I do the weekly Our SQL podcast, so I have a co-host. It's a lot of fun. We talk about MySQL stuff. So if you're interested in MySQL, that's it. I wrote a book. I have one right here too, which I can give away if there's anyone who's interested in it. It's the MySQL Administrator's Bible. It's for intermediate/advanced people. It's pretty cool. There are videos. So youtube.com/tcation. There's a not-for-profit out there called Technocation. And before everyone got this whole idea of let's get professional videos in, I would go around with my handheld, well, it wasn't handheld, it was on tripod, and I'd video things. And so it's not professional quality, but it's free. It's on YouTube. So you can go there and learn about, if you missed a MySQL conference or something, there might be videos there. And Planet MySQL is where the blogging happens. So that being said, we've got 2 more minutes. Are there any questions, comments, suggestions, or feedback? Speaking of feedback, actually, you have this little sheet here, the conference feedback. And what you need to do now is you need to go to line number 3 on the presentations and just circle the number 5 there. That's great. You don't have to read it. No, but seriously, take this with you, and after every session, just if you have any notes or comments, put it there, because it's really, really useful to everyone. Tell all your friends to circle line 3, even if they weren't here. Ethan will be like, I was in the room. There weren't like 70 people in the room, but 70 people gave it a 5. So it's paper forms only. There you go. Anything, Bueller? So what I usually do is I'll usually give the book to anyone who specifically asked a great question, but there were 4 people who did that. Is there anyone who's specifically interested in this? And then we'll have a bake-off or something. Anyone who's like, hey, I'm a DBA or have a friend who's a DBA who would love this book? Don't all raise your hands at once. This is a very heavy book, and I'm going on to San Francisco. I got 2.5 more weeks. I don't want to carry this 3-pound book around.
Well, I'd like to give the opportunity to any of the attendees, but
Yeah.
everybody's jumping up and down.
Because, the other thing is, if you have a monitor that needs raising a couple inches, this is great for that. Works great as a doorstop. Self-defense. I'm happy to donate it to the Nagios library, or you would use it probably. Then that's more than enough for me. So here you go. I would probably I have this door that needs to be stopped or needs to be propped open. Either way. Yeah. And there are CDs for the podcast. So the podcast is free. You can find it on FeedBurner or iTunes or whatever you use to feed podcasts. But we made CDs because sometimes people forget, and they'd be like, 6 months later, they would, Now what will happen is now you get home and 6 months later, you'll be like, oh, yeah, that CD. And I was mentioning before that for our 100th episode, which we haven't made the CDs yet because that was 8 episodes ago, we actually got Randall Monroe, who writes XKCD. We interviewed him. So that was that's actually a 2-part interview, which was actually kind of cool because we started at episode 0. So episode 99 was really our 100th episode, and it was a 2-part interview. So episode 99 and 100 he talks about data security and privacy in the first one, and the second one he talks about the ball pit that he made in his apartment. So you don't have to be super uber tech savvy to do that, to listen to it and have fun. And it was really a really good time. So thank you so much.